When you think about how a colony becomes a country, it's not always about a single fiery revolution. Sometimes it's a slow, deliberate journey of evolution. And that's exactly what we're looking at today. The constitutional blueprint that took the British colony of Ceylon and transformed it piece by piece into the independent nation of Sri Lanka. Let's dig in.
So we're going to break this down into four key parts. First, we'll see how the British laid the initial colonial foundation. Then, we'll look at the very first steps toward local representation. After that, a really radical shift in power. And finally, we'll examine the actual constitution that was designed to launch an independent nation. And here's our roadmap for this journey. Just look at this timeline. From the moment the British took full control in 1815, it took over 130 years of reforms and new constitutions to finally get to independence in 1948. Each one of these dates is a critical turning point in that story.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, all the way back in 1833. Before this, the island was actually governed as a bunch of different regions. The Colebrook Constitution was the very first time the British tried to create one single unified system of government for the entire island.
And you gotta understand, this was a huge deal. For the very first time, the historically separate Kandyan kingdoms and the coastal provinces were all smashed together into one administrative unit. Now, even if the British did it for their own convenience, this act of unification really did lay the groundwork for the modern state of Sri Lanka.
So how did this new government actually work? Well, they created two main groups. You had the Executive Council, which was purely for advice and was made up of only British officials. Then there was the Legislative Council. This one had a few Ceylonese members, but, and this is the key part, they were appointed, not elected, and they were always outnumbered by the Brits. And that really gets to the heart of it. It didn't matter who was in the room, because the British governor held all the cards. I mean, he could introduce laws, he could veto any decision, and he could just flat out ignore any advice he didn't like. All the power was completely centralized in his hands, period.
But, that kind of absolute control was never going to last forever. Local groups and associations started pushing and pushing hard for reforms. And over the next couple of decades, we start to see the very first hard-won cracks appearing in that colonial structure. This was the beginning of a slow, gradual expansion of representation. It starts in 1910. The McCollum reforms bumped up the number of people on the Legislative Council to 20. Then, just a decade later, the Manning reforms in 1920 pushed that number up again, this time to 37.
And by 1924, it grew one more time to 49 members. But this last step was a really big one, because for the first time ever, the unofficial members, many of whom were Ceylonese, actually outnumbered the British officials. The balance of power was starting to tilt just a little bit.
But, and this is a huge but, who could actually vote for these new representatives? Well, as you can see, the rules were incredibly strict. You had to be a man, you had to be literate, and you had to have a pretty high minimum income. What this all meant was that only a tiny, tiny fraction of the population, basically the elite, got any say at all.
Okay, so this slow pace of reform just wasn't cutting it. The demand for real self-government was getting louder, and it led to a special commission from Britain. The result? In 1931, we get the Donoughmore Constitution, and this thing was genuinely revolutionary for its time. It was a complete break from anything seen before in a British colony.
So what exactly made it so radical? Well, it came down to three massive changes. First, it got rid of the old councils and created a single state council to do everything. Second, it created a really unique system of executive committees, which basically put Ceylonese members in charge of running government departments. And third, the real game changer. It introduced universal franchise. And I mean, this was monumental. Just think about it. Overnight, the right to vote was given to every single adult, man and woman over the age of 21. All those income and literacy tests, gone. This was a massive leap toward a real democracy, giving political power to ordinary people for the very first time. The Donoughmore system was a bold experiment, no doubt, but as World War II came to an end, the push for full independence was unstoppable. It was time for the final constitutional step. A new commission, the Salisbury Commission, was sent to design a government for a free and independent Ceylon. And the model they chose was one they knew very well, the British Westminster system. Basically, this meant creating a government with a prime minister and a cabinet, all chosen from an elected parliament that they had to answer to. It was a familiar structure, but it was about to be adapted for a brand new, independent Sri Lanka.
But this new state wasn't just about a parliament. The plan was much more detailed. It set up independent bodies to run the civil service and the court system, trying to keep them free from political meddling. And, crucially, it actually wrote safeguards for minority groups directly into the Constitution itself.
The new parliament had two parts, or two houses. The House of Representatives was the main engine room, the one with members directly elected by the people. The Senate, on the other hand, was meant to be a house of review, a place for experts and distinguished folks to provide a second opinion. But the Constitution made it crystal clear. The real power was with the elected House. And so, with this whole constitutional framework finally in place, the long journey reached its destination. On February 4th, 1948, after more than a century of British rule and all those decades of gradual reform, Ceylon officially became an independent nation.
When you look back, Sri Lanka's path to freedom was literally paved with constitutional maps drawn by the British. The final structure was a carefully designed machine built on that Westminster model. And that leaves us with a really critical question. Could a blueprint designed by a colonial power truly hold up to the pressures and serve the needs of a new independent nation in all the decades that were to come?